ethical decision for working with older adults, presented by Holman Sims and hosted by the American Foundation. We will be short, but before we do, a few housekeeping. I would like to direct you to the left side of your screen where you will see 5 tabs labeled your bio, basic on CE application here, FAQ troubleshoot, and event resources. The slides for today's presentation are available for download under the tab labeled Event Resources. You will find information on how to obtain credits for this event under the CE application here tab, including a link to our CE guidance webpage. We have changed our CE application process. Now you will be able to instantly download your CE certificate.
How you doing?
After all your CE certificates.
Ready for ethics training?
Maybe.
You get your sins, you have to do this all the time.
You must use this entire hour-long webinar to be eligible for CE credit and access the application. You will be able to access the application 2 hours after viewing the event once the sentence is received and recorded. If you are not logged into the webinar directly using the email address you registered with, then you will not be eligible for CE credit as we have no way of tracking your online attendance.
Oh, cool. I can download it
You will
too.
also receive a follow-up email by the end of the business day that will direct you on how to take CE, including links to save.
Everything okay? You're hanging in there.
Yeah, okay, so we're not here, so you can see the continuing education application. If you have any questions during today's presentation, you can send those to us at any time using the.
I wish it would be louder.
And we can 10 to 15 minutes of today's programming to get to those questions. And now I would like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Lakeland Eisenberger. Dr. Eisenberger serves as gerontologist and caregiving advocate at the global headquarters of Homestead. Lakeland began her career at the local Homestead franchise in Omaha, working one-on-one with seniors and care professionals. Today, at the global headquarters, Lakeland works to educate professionals aging, families, and communities on the older adult stage and the resources available. Lakeland earned a PhD in gerontology from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She has spoken at national and international conferences on the topic of care and aging.
Is that loud
Serves
enough?
as a resource to major media, including Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz. She also values giving
We'll be
back to
introducing you
community,
like this in
currently
4 or 5
serving as
years.
a board member of the National Alliance for Caregiving, board chair for the Dreamweaver Foundation, and member of the Alzheimer's Association's
She looks
Dementia
young.
Care Provider Roundtable. Lakeland has a passion for helping others, especially aging adults and their families. We are so excited to have you here with us today, Lakeland.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. This is my first webinar with you all in 2023, and I am delighted to be talking to you about such an important topic that really impacts all of us that work in the aging field, really all professionals in general, and that is ethics. So as you know, professionals in this aging industry, this field, it's really important to recognize the ethical issues that could arise when we're working with older adults. And there are multiple areas in which we can find ethical issues. We can find them, in complex family dynamics, addressing end-of-life issues, preserving dignity and respect, promoting independence, and keeping individuals safe. And there are various factors that can make older adults vulnerable to things like abuse and neglect and ill intent. But there are ethical principles that can guide us as we handle these ethical issues. And by better understanding all of these ethical issues and kind of the principles of ethics, we can help to reduce the risk of harm. We can advocate for those that we work with. And then in instances when it's necessary, we can then report issues to the proper authority. So that's all the things we're going to cover today. Here are our objectives. So we're going to start by talking about those ethical principles of caregiving. We're also going to talk about
If you want me to type her question, let me know and
neglect.
I'll type it in.
Then we're going to talk about how to support decision-making, independence, and dignity. And then finally, we'll learn about some additional resources for working through kind of these ethical issues and also a decision-making model. And so when I talk about ethics, I always have to mention a professor at the Creighton University. She's the founder of the Business Ethics Alliance there, Beverly Crocker. She has just been someone that I've looked to as a mentor when it comes to ethics, and she always provides me with great guidance and resources. And so I have to give credit where credit is due, and she is just a fantastic resource. So, what are ethics? You probably heard of this before, but when we work with older adults, it is really important to treat them with dignity and respect. And really, of course, we should treat all people with dignity and respect. And many of us get into this field for a variety of reasons, but often it's because we value older adults, we have a caring heart or nature, we're drawn to this work, and so really, it's kind of innate in a lot of us to want to treat them with dignity and respect, and that's a big part of ethics. But formally defined, ethics is a system of moral values or a set of principles of conscientious conduct. Say that 3 times fast. Most of the time, it really is just doing the right thing and honoring someone's decision. And a lot of times it's easy to do those right things, but you may have issues that arise from time to time that create challenging situations that really make you pause, think, reflect on, okay, what is the most ethical thing that I can do, or how will my ethics and values impact the situation? And the professionals, the healthcare professionals, they have codes of ethics for their various professions. So for many of us, schooling is drilled into us, or through training, or through our company's code of conduct. However, family caregivers, when it comes to the care of their loved ones, they may not know some of the attributes that can make an older adult vulnerable. They might not recognize the impact that their decisions have on the caring for. And they may never have cared for a loved one before in this capacity. So again, we need a little guidance or support. And we often will come to a professional, like many of you on this call, for that guidance and support. So again, we talked about the definition of ethics, but what it boils down to is doing the right thing and to uphold the dignity and respect of the person that we're working with. But there are some laws in place to help guide us. So let's take a look at what laws exist today that kind of help guide us in terms of ethics. As part of the Patient Protection in Affordable Care Act in 2010, the Elder Justice Act was the first piece of federal legislation passed to authorize a specific source of federal funds to address elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation, which is a really important ethical consideration when working with older adults. This act was the first comprehensive legislation to address elder abuse. It authorizes the first federal funding for the state adult protective service program. The EJA also provides additional support to the long-term care ombudsman program. I'm sure you're familiar with this program, but they work to resolve problems related to the health, safety, welfare, and rights of those individuals that live in long-term care facilities such as nursing homes, assisted living, and other residential care communities. Ombudsman programs promote policies and consumer protections to improve long-term care services and support at the facility, local, state, and national level. Ombudsmen are great resources within these communities, and I know over the years I've worked with many families who have engaged with ombudsmen when they have kind of come up against some issues or challenges with the community with their loved while these laws are really important, I do want to make a distinction between laws and ethics. So a law is really the minimum that we must do to protect older adults, while ethics should be the maximum. So an ethical person follows the law, but is also guided by higher principles. An ethical person does the noble and right thing and bases their actions and decision making on it. So again, it's really important to know the laws. That's the bare minimum, but we try to go above and beyond in terms of the ethics to do the very best we can for the older adult that we're working for in the scenario that we're encountering. And I mentioned already several times that there are some attributes of age that can cause vulnerability. And so we're going to talk about what those attributes are. I personally love working with older adults because it's a group of diverse and vibrant individuals. I was just having a conversation the other day about 100-year-olds and centenarians and how they have just seen so much change over the course of history and the advancement of technology. And so one of the many reasons I love working in this field is just hearing their stories. They all have different lived experiences. They still have so much to give to our society. And while the differences exist, there are some common attributes that can increase a person's vulnerability. So it's important, again, for us as professionals to be aware of these and important to educate family caregivers about them. Because likely this is a review for all of us on today's webinar, but for family members, they might not take into account that these things could make your loved one vulnerable. So there's a lot of attributes listed on the screen, so I'll highlight some of them. Isolation and loneliness. We saw this pre-pandemic. It was heightened during the pandemic, and it still is a concern for the population today. And one of the big concerns around isolation and loneliness is that it can lead to physical and mental health issues that can make older adults more vulnerable. Also, health status and physical decline in and of itself can limit a person's activity and mobility. It increases their need for care and support and often increases their dependability on another person for that care and support, which can, in some situations, make them vulnerable. Older adults also experience personal losses. It could be the death of a spouse or a friend. It could be a loss of independence, such as having to give up driving. Even retirement in a service can be considered a personal loss. And so these personal losses can make them more vulnerable. Cognitive impairment also lists some of the early signs of cognitive impairment across the various types of dementia. Poor judgment. Might be the deterioration of the brain might be impacting the frontal lobe, those kind of impacting decision making. And so it could lead a person to become vulnerable. And then as cognitive impairment progresses for some into dementia, various types of dementia like Alzheimer's disease, the person can lose their ability to care for themselves and their reliability of others increases. Also social supports. We've been talking a little bit already about the need to rely on others for help, and often social supports are part of that. So who is that person leaning on for social support? And often it's the family that comes along and takes care of an older adult. But we know that many older adults, they might not have family, or maybe they're long distance, or maybe they're estranged from their family. We see this sometimes in the LGBTQ population. And so those social supports or lack of social supports can make a person vulnerable. Also financial security, socioeconomic status. Those who lack financial security in older age may be more vulnerable. Those living in poverty or in kind of resource deserts, they might not have access to services and support. We're also seeing, environmental factors that are making older adults more vulnerable. They live might impact and their access to services and support, especially in rural communities. We're also seeing a lot more natural disasters that can make an older adult more vulnerable. Flooding, hurricanes, extreme heat, extreme cold, those kinds of things. That could be something that we take into consideration. Also, institutionalization. I realize, you know, you might think of that kind of as an old-fashioned term, but for those living in some sort of care community or care facility, while it's very necessary and serves a really good purpose, and majority of those community settings have high quality of care, we do know that sometimes individuals in those communities can be more vulnerable. That's why the Ombudsman program was created, to help families and the staff kind of work through some of those challenges and to protect them. And then one thing I think that is maybe unique to this population of older adults is that often they're less likely to report abuse. And it could be due to a variety of reasons. It could be that they're dependent on the person that is abusing them, and they're afraid if they say something that maybe that person won't be able to care for them, or maybe it will impact the type of care that they're providing, the quality of care. They might be embarrassed to come forth and report, or they might not even recognize that the abuse is happening. And so when you look at the numbers of abuse and neglect, a lot of the experts say that it's likely underreported. So these are really important things to keep in mind when we talk about ethics, especially amongst the older adult population. So I mentioned that there are these ethical principles that can help us as we kind of work through some of this. And before I go over these definitions, it's important to note that the terminology can vary from person to profession. And the terms really don't matter as much as the meaning behind them. The meaning to guide the work that we do with older adults. These ethical principles that are shown on the slide were first introduced by Buchandt and Childress, in the late 70s. They identified 4 principles that are at the core of ethical reasoning. Now, their work was specific to healthcare. I think, again, I mentioned it can vary profession to profession, but they honed in on these: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. First, autonomy is the principle that addresses respect for independence and self-determination.
If you have any questions,
The essence of this principle is allowing the individual the freedom of choice and action. And next is
it's the
justice,
same as our code of ethics.
which seeks the various benefits and burdens based on fairness and equality. Next, beneficence, simply stated, means to do good, to be proactive, and also to prevent harm when possible. And non-maleficence is the concept of not causing harm to others. So it's often explained as, above all, do no harm. And then there's this 5th ethical principle that sometimes you see grouped in, and that's fidelity. And again, this depends on the profession, but when I think about family caregivers, this one really sticks because it involves the notion of loyalty, faithfulness, and the honoring of commitment. And when I think about family caregivers, often they are very loyal. They're very faithful. They feel like, it's their duty to provide this care to somebody who maybe took care of them as a way to honor that person. We know that when any of these ethical principles are overlooked, the person might be at risk for neglect or abuse. So we see these ethical principles here. We have 5, but there are different ways of driving the use of ethical principles, and I hope this kind of explanation helps to kind of explain what I mean by that. So these ethical principles are embedded in professionals, in organizations, and in culture. And they really can be broken down into 2 categories, one being formal, the other being informal. So there are formal dimensions to culture. These would be things like policies, codes of ethics, those that work in the medical field might have that, value statements, rules and regulations, bills of rights, so forth and so on. And it involves processes like how to report, how to care for a patient. And for those that have a license or certification, it could involve an ethical review board or standard review. And these formal dimensions of culture, they're a driver of these ethical principles, and these formal dimensions are usually written down and planned out. They're usually pretty formal. But the informal dimensions of culture, on the other hand, are things such as the norms for how people actually do things. You might hear, within your respective organizations, well, the policy says, but how we actually do it is dot, dot, dot. That's kind of that informal dimension. It's the stories that are told. It's the observed behavior. It could be, kind of considered that water cooler talk, that informal dimension of culture. And they're often not written down and more spontaneous. So I want to pause here and ask for you to think about your organization or your role and think about the formal and informal dimensions of culture in the work that you do and how these drive ethical principles. Most of us that work with older adults, if you within that category, you likely have some sort of, bill of rights. If you're, I know, a certified senior advisor, they have a code of ethics. Medical professionals have codes of ethics. Those in the legal field have codes of ethics. So those are those formal dimensions of culture. So think and reflect just for a moment. What are your formal dimensions of culture? And then think about those informal dimensions of culture. And then also think about how you're personally influencing those informal dimensions of culture. I think that's kind of a powerful thing to reflect on. What are your values? How are you living those out in your day-to-day work or day-to-day interactions? So I won't give us too much time to ponder on that because I have a lot of great information to share, but it might be something to reflect on after today's webinar. So I mentioned that bills of rights might be one formal example of a driver's ethical principle. So again, it might look different between a hospital setting or a senior living community or a counseling practice, elder law office. The same kind of principles apply. Often, this client or resident bill of rights respects the rights of the individual and are based, again, on some ethical principles that involve the self-determination and personal choice. So again, one example, individuals have the right to consider respectful treatment of care, not to be abused, to, design their treatment plan of service, to refuse treatment, a right to privacy, a right to file a complaint, and a right for confidentiality of their personal information. So these are often kind of the things you will see. So as professionals, we have these formal and informal drivers. So let's consider it from a family caregiver perspective. There are very few formal dimensions of ethics of these cultural drivers when it comes to family caregivers. Most all of it is informal. Maybe they're observing other caregivers, maybe they're in a support group and hearing from others how they're doing it, maybe they're searching online, but many do not have prior experience caring for a loved one. So that's why you might have family caregivers looking to you as a professional for guidance and support when it comes to these issues, ethical issues of caregiving. We'll talk more about these common ethical issues that we see in our field and get into each of them a little bit. So an overarching common ethical challenge that we see is this principle of autonomy, the right to be able to make decisions about their own care. As adults, we often take advantage or we're kind of, we don't realize in maybe our younger years or our midlife just how much we get in our day-to-day life. We get to make our own decisions, and as you age, you still want that autonomy. Older adults want autonomy. They want to be able to make their own decisions. They want to be able to vote, to open their own mail. They want their medical records to be kept private. They want to have a say in their plan of care or in their medical treatment. They want to participate in decision-making and have control over where they live, the type of care they have in their home. And they'll make a move depending on what the situation is. They may feel a threat to their autonomy. You know, especially if they're in a community living setting, we see an effort towards person-centered care in those communities, but in some scenarios, they may be told what to eat, what time to wake up, you know, maybe even what to wear, and that can be hard to accept. And you know, when it comes to family caregivers, a lot of times family caregivers have the best of intentions. They want to help and support, but sometimes the older adult themselves feels like their child's overstepping or not giving them the autonomy, not involving them in the conversation around decisions around their care. So I think, you know, as you're in friendship, something that I talk to families a lot about, you know, your older adult loved ones, even if they have cognitive impairment, they're still a person. They still have wants, beliefs, desires, values. And it's important to ask them about it. What is important to them? How can they be involved in this decision making? So again, I kind of got off on my soapbox there, I apologize. But in autonomy, there are a lot of these ethical issues here on the slide. So I'll cover some of them in more detail, and I'll skim over a couple of them here, but they're all important. So first is ageism. And this occurs in a variety of environments, but we see it manifest a lot in medical care and in kind of sometimes community living. Areas where sometimes older adults can be vulnerable. So, for example, in the healthcare field, you know, maybe a healthcare provider is just inclined to suggest a less aggressive treatment based on the age of the person or a belief that the older adult needs to rest. And maybe they don't encourage physical activity or mental activity, even though we know that physical activity has benefits for all ages. So some of these misconceptions can lead to things like misdiagnosis or poor results in outcome and treatment. And I also recognize that there's also a conversation around the fact that the medical field sometimes overprescribes for older adults. But again, I think we have to go back to that autonomy. The older adult should be involved in their plan of care if they're able to contribute. And the ageism happening, you know, outside of the medical field as well. Later in this year's webinar series, I'm going to be doing a two-part series on ageism, one about society and one about ageism in healthcare. So I hope that you'll join us for those in the coming months. Another category that we see ethical issues arise is in bias and discrimination. It's important to consider how this impacts our ethical decision making, especially in the areas of racial discrimination, sexual orientation, gender, those types of things. As an example, this type of bias and discrimination may manifest itself in resource allocation decisions or the design of support systems. It really is encouraging to see a movement to provide training on bias and discrimination to help all of us reduce the risk of these ethical issues. So we do need to acknowledge that they definitely exist. Another ethical issue is personal privacy. I've touched on it, but especially important for those living in community settings or, you know, those living in a multi-generational home. You know, people coming in and out of their room or apartment throughout the day without knocking, that's an invasion, even if that person, again, has cognitive impairment. And so in these instances, it can be really helpful for us as professionals or to encourage the family caregiver to put ourselves in their shoes, consider how we would like to be approached. It can be really helpful to be mindful of a person's personal privacy. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind. Another ethical issue is grievances and complaints. I mentioned this earlier, but an older adult might be less likely to express complaints because of the fear they'll be treated differently, especially if they're reliant on that person for care. So it's important that older adults know that they have a right to express grievances without fear of retribution. At our organization, Home Instead, at our corporate office, we have an ombudsman and a team that helps with this process to ensure that people receiving care and also those that are employed by our organization have an ombudsman that we will hear and address their grievances or complaints. And so that's something really important that we found. So, you might reflect on your organization. Do you have a process in place for grievances and complaints that people feel comfortable moving forward without fear of retribution? Another thing that didn't make this list that I just was thinking a little bit more about the other day was driving. Because a lot of times when I give this presentation or a presentation like this, I get questions about driving. Because especially for family caregivers, they really struggle with taking away the keys or encouraging their loved ones to cut back on things. And so again, another topic this year that I'll be covering is driving. So I hope that you will come back for that discussion because we spend all day talking about ethical issues around driving. But before we dive, I want to dive deeper into some of these common ethical issues, and the first of which is capacity and competency. So on this next slide, sometimes this is confusing, and I have to admit that sometimes it's even a little confusing to me. I'll be the first to admit I am not a lawyer, so this is a great area to consult a legal professional that you want. It's important to understand that a person's ability to make decisions can influence decision-making in a lot of ethical situations. And capacity is the ability to make decisions. And capacity is a fluid concept. An individual may have capacity in one moment and then lack capacity in another. Competency is the ability to perform action needed to put a decision into effect. And competency is really a legal thing. So the opposite of competency is incompetency, which is the lack of ability to understand either healthcare or financial management of decisions. So again, these two are different. Let's dive a little bit deeper here on the next one. People sometimes assume that decisional capacity is kind of an all or nothing ability. Either you have it or you don't. And this is sometimes framed as whether a person is competent or incompetent to manage affairs. But the reality is more complex than that. It's important to understand that capacity is decision specific. It means that a person's capacity should be evaluated in the light of a specific decision to be made, because it can fluctuate based on the circumstances. And generally, capacity requires that the individual is able to understand, one, what situation they are in, two, the decision in question, and three, the consequences of making a given choice. So for an example, most people immediately after surgery are drowsy. They may be coming off of anesthesia, might be on medication, and in this state, they might lack the capacity to address anything more than simple decision-making. But their decision-making capacity should improve as the person mentally and physically recovers from that surgery. In dementia, it's important for documents and plans to be put in place while the individual still has the capacity to do so. The financial capacity, financial judgment, that often declines before some of the other factors. It's really important that if somebody's demonstrating cognitive decline, that decisions are made evaluating their capacity and competency, and also there's really a movement to diagnose cognitive decline sooner, so that important documents and discussions can be had before the cognitive decline gets to a point where that person's capacity and competency is in question. And I think also I mentioned earlier, person-centered care is an important movement when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia care. It's really meeting the person where they're at on that day. And so, for you as a professional, if you're trying to wait, someone's comprehension in a decision in a moment in time, you might want to kind of ask them a few questions to reflect with them on maybe the decision or the information we discussed. So, for example, let's say you're in a process or you're kind of going over a care plan and you're talking about a new medication. So you might ask that individual, can you tell me in your own words what you understand about this medicine, what it will do for you, and how often you need to take it? And that might help you gauge that person's understanding, that person's competency in that moment. And again, this is a very complex issue, and so for those that are needing to make really important decisions that impact someone's health or finances, it's really important, to bring in an elder law attorney to create those power of attorney for healthcare, for finances, and to really talk through those situations. But, when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia, it gets extra tricky because sometimes the person, you have a really good day, they seem to be very lucid and in the moment, and then there are other days where they may not. In that state, they might be more distant, they might be less engaged, and so that can be a challenge. Again, I'm the first to admit I'm not a legal expert, and I'm still learning about the difference between capacity and competency, but it is important in our field, especially in the older adult population. Next, ethical kind of category or issue that sometimes arises is confidentiality and professional boundaries. Most professionals have an obligation to keep confidentiality. And ethical principles of autonomy require laws are also put in place to protect the confidentiality of our information, especially things like HIPAA or PHI, regulatory guidelines, those sorts of things. However, the only time it's acceptable to break confidentiality is due to a situation of mandatory reporting of something like abuse or their decision making. It's also important to maintain a professional relationship. Often when you work with older adults, you're passionate about it and you want to develop a relationship, you want to build rapport and build trust with the individual. But it's also important to respect those boundaries of that personal relationship. And it doesn't mean we can't be friendly, it doesn't mean we can't show compassion or support, but we need to, again, maintain that professional boundary. And this even includes, if you're working with a friend, when I was working in our local home care organization, we helped a lot of people in the community that I knew personally or my family had ties to, and I really had to maintain that confidentiality and professional boundaries, even, when I knew them really well, or when my family, how's so-and-so doing? I had to maintain that confidentiality, and I'm sure you all have examples of this in your own profession. Next category, or next kind of issue of ethical decision making is elder. And I don't want to make light of this, but I know that this topic is covered in a lot of educational materials. Something that at least I have gotten a lot of education on, and so I'm kind of making an assumption here that a lot of you on the call have gone through training on elder abuse. So I have these slides in here, but I'm going to kind of go through it quickly because I know there's a lot of great resources and experts in this topic in depth. But we know that this is a very, very, very important ethical issue. We know, if you look at the research again, the percentages vary on the amount of abuse and neglect that happens in the older adult population. One notates about 10% of older adults are are impacted by physical abuse, psychological or verbal abuse, sexual abuse, financial exploitation, and neglect. And again, this is probably a very low number or lower than the three. And so again, those types of abuse are listed up there on the slide, and then the next slide goes a little bit more in depth in the types of neglect. And the one that I want to focus on is self-neglect. So we have listed here, physical neglect, emotional neglect, abandonment, financial neglect, but self-neglect happens when an older adult themselves fails to meet their own physical or social needs, which can threaten their health, safety, and well-being. This includes, providing themselves adequate food, clothing, shelter, health care for their own needs. And self-neglect might be a personal choice, or might be the result of financial inability or physical inability to meet their own personal needs. And self-neglect is one category that I feel like doesn't really get talked about often, but something that we certainly need to pay attention to. So some signs could be, malnutrition, inappropriate clothing, a decline in appearance without explanation, untreated conditions, an unsafe or unsanitary living conditions, unpaid bills, those sorts of things. And this really becomes a problem when a person lacks the ability to understand, even with decision support, the impacts of it. And then also with self-neglect creates a serious harm to others, whether it's public health or public safety. And those that neglect themselves are more likely to be vulnerable to other forms of elder abuse as well. So, if we as those that work in this field notice signs of abuse or neglect in any of these categories, it is really important that we report. And many of us are mandatory reporters. And so, again, I know this is probably something that you have gone over in your training. It's part of your code of ethics. Your organization might have their own protocols when it comes to reporting abuse or neglect. But on the slide, I have kind of the steps for calling 911 or your local adult protective services to report these types of abuse and neglect. So I hope you'll download the slides and you can review that on your own time. I think something when it comes to family caregivers, we can educate them on how to prevent elder abuse. To that ethical principle of doing no harm, preventing harm from happening to those that we're caring for. So, we can do things like be aware of the risks, learning the signs, prevent isolation, providing respite breaks for the caregivers themselves. Because sometimes caregiving can be really overwhelming. I'm sure many of you on this call, you yourself are caregivers or have been caregivers. And having time away can help that person come back refreshed and ready to continue with the care responsibility. I listened to a really interesting podcast with Virgil, and I can't even remember, it was a few years ago. But the person was sharing, in her experience, some of the caregivers, they didn't go into caregiving with the intention of being an abusive caregiver. They were overwhelmed with the responsibilities, and they didn't manage their emotions. They did not take time away from caregiving. They were very, very overwhelmed. And it led to a form of abuse. And I'm not saying it's okay, but what I'm saying is if we can educate caregivers on the support and the resources and encourage them to engage in those supports and resources, perhaps we can prevent some of the elder abuse from occurring. So again, education and providing resources can be really helpful. Encouraging advanced planning, making sure the elder adult is involved in that planning, education on fraud prevention, reporting abuse, of course, professionals we do that. It's also risk awareness. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day happens in June. So one thing you could do is, Google World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and in June, you should bring those important helpful resources to your organization. That could be or to the caregivers that you work with. That could be something impactful that you can do to prevent elder abuse. And then a few more common ethical decisions or ethical issues that I wanted to bring up. One is supported care decisions. So supporting an elder's care decision, end of life decision, is driven by the ethical principle of autonomy and allows the older adult to participate in the decision. And it's important for us as professionals and family caregivers to regard and protect the older adult's choices for things like on care, the discontinuation of treatment. For example, if they decide not to pursue cancer treatment, or life-sustaining interventions, or do not resuscitate orders. And I know over the years I've worked with older adults that have very strong opinions and decisions that they've already made about things in these categories. I remember the first day I went to one of my clients' home, she showed me her do not resuscitate form, and she keeps it taped to the inside of her kitchen cabinet. She shows all of her care providers when they come in that she has. That's important to her. You know, and even with my own grandmother, she told me once, you know, at this point in her life, if she gets diagnosed with cancer, she's not going to pursue treatment. And so these decisions that an older adult makes, sometimes it can be hard for family caregivers to accept that decision, or maybe feel differently than what their loved one has decided. So sometimes there's that kind of internal concept, that ethical dilemma. And then there's also this concept of dignity of risk. I heard this term once, and it's kind of an interesting concept. So it's the right to take reasonable risk, but still allow a person to have dignity and self-esteem. So this is really that balance of autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence. So giving the older adult the autonomy to make their own decisions, but also you're wanting to do what's best for them and keep them safe. And this is especially hard for those caregivers that are really concerned about their duty of care. I call them overprotective or kind of helicopter caregivers. They want to really protect their loved one. And I see this dignity come up a lot in terms of like fall risks. You know, somebody has a series of falls, and the family members are trying so hard to do something about it. They want to make the house safer. They want to put in grab bars. They want to have home care. They're refusing over and over to implement. And you know, one caregiver I talked to, she said, you know what? At this point, everything, I'm just going to wait till that person's fall, and then they're going to realize that they should have listened to me in the first place. And oh, that hurt my heart. But you know, that is that balance that we have to in a way we have to struggle with in terms of ethical decision-making. You know, how much risk do we allow?
That's what you're paying for.
To provide autonomy to that person. And so I don't have the answer to that, but it, you know, I think it's very
She got a question.
but it is something we see more and more. And then the final issue, and I've been talking about it a little bit throughout this presentation already, is when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's, other forms of dementia, cognitive impairment. So people living with type of dementia are still people. They still have thoughts and feelings. They still contribute in meaningful ways. And so really when we care for those living with dementia, Alzheimer's disease, other types of cognitive impairment, we have to balance autonomy, beneficence, and essentially do good for that person. And we know as we progress, the person may not have the capacity to make decisions or informed decisions. And it might be that that person finds it distressing, that they're being ignored in areas where they're still very capable of doing things. So it is important to encourage caregivers to involve in the decision making as much as possible. And a few questions that might help us kind of evaluate you know, that person's ability to engage in the decision making are, you know, can they make a reasonable informed decision? It might be, you know, in the state that they are today, as I mentioned earlier. One day could be a good day, the other day it might not be a great day. Another question to consider, will it cause harm to that
So it
person?
should end right at,
Another question, does the person understand the risks and the benefits? And then finally, is there consistency across time? And that's a really important question, I think, to consider with dementia. In the case of my grandma, she doesn't have dementia, she did. She has talked about, I get cancer, I don't want treatment. She's talked about that with several different family members at several different points in her life. We can assume that that is a really important thing to her. And so that consistency. So that's another kind of
There we
question
go.
that
I asked her a
caregivers
question.
can kind of use to evaluate. And then finally, don't ignore, I've heard from those living with
Okay.
dementia
All
that
right, see y'all.
their family often quick to come in and take over things that they can still do for themselves because maybe it's faster or easier, but that person still wants to do as much. And then, there's often sometimes some ethical dilemmas that arise when moving to a facility or an environment, kind of weighing risks of autonomy and making sure that the environment is safe for that individual. So there's a lot of ethical issues that we touched on. But what can be helpful is having an ethical discussion. And this model developed by Dr. Crawford,
Okay, yeah, he does. Oh, yeah, he sends like 25.
And she has.
I think you would pause project on that.
And
Prices,
then step 4 is deciding the right. So understanding the
Donuts. Yep,
She encourages us to,
and to grow your own food, learn how to just
what is the actual
create
issue at
food.
hand, and what are the conflicting ethical values? What is
The best website
Sometimes we really
on
can get caught
YouTube
up
for
in
food decades is the
we
Urban
get
Farming
caught up in
Guys.
What are the facts? And then who all involved? Who is
They got cool
impacted
stuff.
by the stakeholders? So we need to take that into consideration. And then we have to imagine the options. At first glance, what is the best and the obvious solution? But then on second thought, what are the out of the box solutions we should consider? Then step 3, he encourages us to think through the options and to think far, wide, and think high. So under think far, think about what is in it for us or for me. Which option will provide the best and the greatest good for all concerned, all of those stakeholders. So think wide. What are legal, professional, organizational, human rights and responsibilities required? What is fair? And then to think high. What are aspirations of the people and or the organizations involved? And which of the options would you respect and be proud of?
All right, everybody. So, if you don't have any questions, I won't submit them for the speaker. If you do, I will stay on for a minute or comment on this, and I will submit that to her. She finishes in 5 minutes. So, see you later and have a